This talk is based on my BA dissertation research that was done at Ridley Hall in Cambridge, where I sought to marry my studies in children's ministry with my interest in liberation theology. Next slide, please. I'd like to start with a story. I first came here to Cliff College 27 years ago. I was age 16, I was a brand new Christian, and I was helping with children's work at a conference here. I'd like to suggest to you, based on my experience then, that inclusion matters. I was included in that team, despite my lack of experience and certainly my lack of wisdom. I had plenty of enthusiasm, and I was invited along. And the experience of serving alongside other more experienced members of the church was vital and formative to me at that time. I felt part of the community, as if I had something to offer, even though I really can't see, with my lack of experience, what I had to offer at the time. And it gave me much more than I did offer. Over 3 summers before I left home, I returned here and was involved in what was really inspirational ministry to the children at that conference. And it feels to me there's a sort of symmetry of coming back after so many years to reflect on children's inclusion. So next slide, please. What will be included in my talk? I first of all like to start with the Gospels. What did Jesus say about children? How did he interact with them? I would then like to take my interest in liberation theology to analyse those encounters, particularly as I couldn't find any evidence of anyone having done this before. This leads us then to think about, well, what are the implications for the church of these findings? And finally, I'd like to think about what the implications have been for our church, because the research that I did led us to a small-scale research project that Jenny referenced in our church, which I would like to share the brief headlines of with you. Next slide, please. So I'd like you to close your eyes for a minute or two and think about a moment in the Gospels where Jesus encounters a child. I expect you maybe had a few to choose from. I hope you did. Next slide, please. There are plenty, actually. And I find it quite difficult that I had to choose 4 for my dissertation. And I'm going to take you on a whistle-stop tour through them. If you want to follow along, then get your Bibles ready. But you may be better to go back and check them later. The first one that I would like to talk about with you is Matthew 18, 1-4. Jesus takes a child into the midst. In answering the question of who is the greatest in the kingdom, he says, you have to become like a child. And more than that, you have to welcome a child to welcome me. That is an astonishing statement. Have you ever stopped and thought about what Jesus is saying there? To welcome me, you must welcome a child. The second passage then is from Mark, chapter 10, verses 13 to 16. Jesus is teaching his disciples, and as people, adults, probably the parents, bring children towards him, probably for a blessing in the rabbinic style, the disciples try and stop the children from coming. Jesus rebukes them, and he is indignant. It's the only time we see that phrase in Mark's gospel about Jesus. He says, "Let the little children come to me. Do not stop them. Whoever does not receive the kingdom of God as a little child will never enter it." Again, an astonishing statement that we probably don't always think about the implications of. The third passage that I chose to look at was in Mark 5, 21-43, thinking about the raising of Jairus' daughter. It also has parallels in Luke and Matthew. I chose this one because it features probably one of the most marginalised in the Hellenistic society, a girl child. And this particular girl child, Jairus' daughter, is on the cusp of adulthood. So she's on the point of becoming more useful in an economic sense in this sort of Greco-Roman culture. The affection that Jairus shows for her might be considered to be surprising given how children were treated in the Greco-Roman world in terms of their neglect and the brutal treatment that they often faced. So it's interesting to reflect on Jesus focusing on Jairus' daughter, raising her up, bringing her back to life, and then suggesting that they give her something to eat. The final passage is different again. It's in Luke 2, 41-52, and we only find this in Luke. This is Jesus choosing to stay in the temple. He defies his earthly family, which in itself is surprising in those days of absolute obedience expected from children, and prioritizes his father's house. In the sense of the Roman importance of the father of the family, what would be known as the pater familias, Jesus chooses God as the most important pater familias, the head of the family, over his earthly family. In this passage, Jesus speaks for the first time, and he also receives instruction. He challenges the sense of the earthly family being most important, and later on in his ministry he returns to this. We might describe it as being sort of fictive kinship, the kinship of his church family, his family in faith, of being as important, if not more important, than the biological legal family. So God is pointed to in this passage as being the most important pater familias. If we could have the next slide, we could see then the themes that we drew out from these passages are three very clear ideas, I think, that Jesus gives us about children. Number one, that he welcomed them and they participated. He called them to him. They were at the centre of the community. Number two, the children have a privileged place in the kingdom of God. And number three, children should have some agency of their own and equality with adults now, not just valuing them for their future potential. This was very common in Greco-Roman times. Childhood was a period just to be got through, but you would be useful as an adult, but still obedient to your parents throughout your life, including caring for them in their old age. But is it too controversial to say that children are still valued for their future economic potential today? In the church, in our very rigid schooling system, it's all about the future. What about valuing childhood as a period of its own importance? So, if we could have the next slide then, we will take these themes and passages and think about them with reference to liberation theology. I'd like to start with a quote from a theologian, Adrian Thatcher, that I've relied on heavily in my research. "I'm still shocked at the lack of attention this theological literature gives to children. With notable exceptions, theologies of all types, schools and branches, past and present, theoretical and practical, stands accused. Given the teachings of Jesus about children, this hiatus is extraordinary." This neglect that we have seen of children in the research and in the church. Liberation theology, sadly, is no exception to this trend. If we could have the next slide, please. A little bit of background for you. The original liberation theology emerged in Latin America in the 1970s in the context of poverty and political oppression. It stated very clearly a preferential option for the poor, but there was little or no mention of children that I have found. The father of liberation theology could be considered to be Gustavo Gutierrez, and he thought of three options for the development of liberation theology. After this period, theologies of liberation more broadly developed all over the globe and into the 21st century, including in the United Kingdom. There has been debate, understandably, about whether this theology can be applied to more economically advantaged countries, but generally I think it's accepted that it can. If we think about this option for the marginalised and oppressed, it can certainly be applied to children through much of history. In my context now in rural Cambridgeshire, the focus is less on economic liberation, although certainly there are definitely pockets of deprivation. But it can also apply, according to Gutierrez's theory, to liberation from sin and full personhood. So economic liberation, liberation from sin, and full personhood are the three pointers that he suggests. And these latter two are certainly pertinent to children in the UK and all around the world. And I would suggest that economic liberation is still very important for a number of children as well. I'll explore how these might be applied a little bit later on. Liberationists often use a language of non-personhood when referring to the marginalised, and this can certainly apply to children as well as marginalised adults. This term, little ones, that we see in the Bible, sometimes refers to little ones, mikroi, or little children, pedia. Whichever phrase is used, I would like to argue that it can be applied to children, even if it's not literally little children. Little ones has been interpreted sometimes as the socially weak or the new to Christianity. But I would suggest that this can still apply to children. It could be like children and including them. Adrian Thatcher is one of the very few theologians to propose a theology of liberation for children, based on the idea of securing the flourishing for all children. And he focuses on the flourishing of children within the family situation, as sadly in our country and across the world, sometimes children do require liberation from difficult situations within the family and within the community. Thus, I would suggest that a marrying of the theologies of childhood and liberation is long overdue, and I think also is supported by the secular children's right movement. If we could have the next slide, please. What then are the implications for the church? The most obvious thing to draw from this is the welcome and participation of children in the church. And I think the question is, can churches, which sometimes lack any children, make the necessary changes to be truly and radically welcoming in the model of Jesus, putting children in the centre? Jesus showed inclusion of children. We can give them full life and participation in the church. If we think about the second theme, Jesus privileges them in the place of the kingdom of God. And the lessons from liberation theology suggest to us that children should be given full personhood and the opportunity of liberation from sin. But does the church allow the children to take their place at the centre of the kingdom? Does it allow them the full personhood? This, I would suggest, is often not the case. Really, I think the clear takeaway from this is how we think about our models of discipling children. As we know, this is a huge matter, and I and many others could do a talk just on this. I have no time to summarise the reasons or justifications behind age-segregated models of children's ministry that often exist. But my question is, do these models put the children's full personhood and spiritual development into practice? When age segregation is enacted, is it for the benefit of the whole church family? I would suggest that's not always the case. This is often an inheritance from the secular learning and school models based on age and learning outcomes. And I'd like to be clear that I certainly do not want to deride the excellent work done by churches all over the country. There's phenomenal work done by children's ministers and all ministers and churches in welcoming and including children in whatever model is appropriate for their churches. This is merely to highlight some questions. If we were to take an intergenerational approach, children truly can be at the centre. But this needs leadership from across the church and gradual culture change. Adults can learn from children too, as Jesus said, but how often can that be facilitated within churches? It's not an easy thing to do. It is, I would suggest, a radical thing to approach, but it can be done gradually. It's important to also note that within an intergenerational model, some age-separate discipleship is needed for all groups, whether it's for children, for young people, for adults, through home groups. Whatever model works in that particular context, it is very important that age-separate time is given. But the question is, on a Sunday morning, when we gather as church family, how are we able to interact across all the generations? This is an important process of enculturation for children. If they are never in the body of the church family, or indeed the church building, then how can they be enculturated? And when it is decided they are suddenly, quotes, old enough to worship with the adults, how will they know how to? How will they connect with God in that situation? Another lesson to take from liberation theology is these ideas of base ecclesial communities. These were grassroots communities that grew up in Latin America, often facilitated by a priest or a leader who would take the Gospels to the people, sometimes impoverished, sometimes illiterate, but would be able to access the Gospels and apply them to their situation, and would bring a reading of a very well-known passage in a completely different light to one that theologians, certainly Western theologians, might have expected. Could this ever work for children? Is it something we can try in allowing children a little bit more agency over their biblical studies? It's something that we've done a little bit in our once a month, our age-separate time is in a Sunday club on a Sunday morning. Sometimes we let the children choose the passage. I'll talk to them about what areas of the Bible are they interested in. We will explore, tell the story with the Bible, sometimes through a godly play style telling, where they can actually get into the story and have open themes and wonderings. The leader, the facilitator, will always have threads, ideas, possible outcomes that can come from that. But it's also an opportunity to give the children agency over their own studies and think about what they see in the passage, because they might surprise us. And as we saw in the Gospels at the beginning, Jesus says that we should learn from them. We should be like them. I'm not saying they should call all the shots by any means. We get some very interesting Bible studies if that was always the case, but they can be given agency. I would like to suggest that actually the non-secular world has a head start here. The agency that children have demanded and taken, as we've seen over the last few years, has been inspirational and a wake-up call and a lesson to adults all over the world. I think of people like Greta Thunberg in the climate crisis and the school strikes. Those children have seen the crisis our world is in, taken the initiative, stood up to adults at the risk of punishment and sometimes expulsion from their schools, and said, this is a crisis that cannot wait. We think also of people like Malala Yousafzai, and children and young people all over the world who are taking the initiative and the agency and actually teaching adults how things should be done. Is there not a parallel within the church? Finally, if we think about equality of all children with adults, this takes us a little bit outside the church. If we're thinking about liberation for children in all senses, personhood and economic liberation, then there may also be a social mission that the churches should be involved in. Theologian Sally Nash said, in an era of cuts to public spending on children, in the UK at least, it may be that the church is the only institution in some communities offering open access provision to children and young people. It is also one that can offer long-term presence. And while employed clergy and workers will come and go, there are usually some people within the congregation who offer continuity of presence and welcome. This is to celebrate and endorse the work that many churches are already doing across the UK. Things like involvement in food banks, toddler and baby groups, that right start in life that they're not necessarily getting anywhere else. Supporting signposting towards other agencies, allowing them to be able to hook into what is needed to support them to flourish. Even things like fostering and adoption, the holistic care for children is something that churches can be involved in. We must not be complicit in a system which only values children for their future economic potential, within or without the church, but rather value them in dignity for who they are now. We should not only focus on what we can teach them, but allow them the opportunity to participate in ways that adults do, and to support adults in their walk with Christ. We can support children in gaining agency over their lives in some measure and owning their faith. All of these things will bring forward God's kingdom and the children at the centre of it. As Thatcher said, after and because of Jesus, childhood is included in what counts as perfect humanhood. There is nothing incomplete, imperfect, or preliminary about it. Whatever childhood is, God the Word became it. If we could have the next slide, please. And the next one. Thank you. So finally, I'd just like to give you some headlines about how we've been seeking to enact these changes in our community. We've undertaken a Growing Faith Foundation funded project looking at being church all together most of the time, looking at faith and belonging in a hybrid intergenerational church in Hazelfield. It's a fairly long-winded title, but the suggestion is that we cannot do a revolutionary intergenerational church in our context where we have one service and we have the needs of multiple generations to take into account. And therefore, we wanted to explore what small changes could be made. We cannot set up and grow from grassroots an intergenerational service as some bigger churches can alongside their other services. So how can we make some changes whilst bringing the rest of the congregation in their approach and what is often a traditional approach to worship as well? So the question is, what is the impact of the hybrid intergenerational model of church, including Forest Church, on the belonging and faith development of children? So if I could have the next slide, please. The way we did this then was to put children at the centre, as you might hope. We did 2 focus groups with children and started with them. The first one, as you can see on the picture on the right, we had spectrum questions, agree or disagree, thinking about is church the building or the people or somewhere in between. And there was no expectation of writing or speaking unless they wanted to, but they could stand between different signs. And then if they'd like to explain why they'd chosen that particular place, agree, disagree, or somewhere in between, that then provoked an organic discussion amongst the children and young people about their perspective on that question. So we could consider how they learned about God, how they prayed, how they worshipped, whether it was at home or church or both. The second focus group I did with the children had much more open-ended questions in terms of their connection with God and asked them to come up with the answers. We also did focus groups with parents and carers, very conscious that any focus on their children's faith development needed to include and celebrate the role that families already had in that. And then finally, we had questionnaires for the whole of the adult church family, thinking about how they viewed our approach to doing church in this context. And more than that, getting them to reflect on what was important for them in their faith journeys by way of better understanding the small but important changes we were making within our church community together. What we found then was there was possibly surprisingly considerable support for the hybrid intergenerational model within our church family, that the adults were enthusiastic about having the children in the body of the church most of the time. The adaptations like tables and different activities were welcomed, and actually a number of the adults said one of the problems was that they weren't entirely sure when they could join in as well in some of the services. We found that the children's belonging is secure and evident in this context, within both the body, the family of the church, and the building itself. It is very much their place as much as any of the adults. This, I would suggest, is fundamental to any faith development. If you haven't got that sense of belonging, then it's going to be much harder for anything else to follow. And we discovered through talking to the children and the parents and carers that their faith development is not hindered by not having age-separate time every week. That through the times we do have it, both at the Sunday Club and at our intergenerational Forest Church, there is enough time to be able to help them in their faith development. But the crucial thing is partnering with families and other agencies and supporting them. And for us in a rural Anglican church, this is crucial. We have limited resources for what we're able to do. And finding ways of partnering has become really important. And the children themselves mentioned those other provisions that they were able to access as being important to them. In some ways, I was surprised by the children's responses and how symbol-centred they were in their ways of connecting with God, where I thought I maybe would have predicted it would be the Bible stories or the music was how they connected. They actually talked very much about the environment of the church itself and the candles and stained glass windows as being ways that they connect with God, as well as those other things which I would have expected more. They all supported, and the parents and carers did, Forest Church as being a very important way of worshipping, developing, having time together and free time together as well as the directed time. That freedom to be children together and play in a church environment is really important. And the children themselves articulated the importance of worshipping in creation. What I found from the adults, who were super supportive of what we were doing within the church building, the church body on a Sunday morning, they were also very supportive of Forest Church, but did not see it as an intergenerational offering we hoped it would be. And in the afternoon, it was very much seen as being that, quotes, fresh expression or separate provision. They would only come with children or grandchildren, were pleased it happened, but didn't feel that it was church for them. That leaves us with a discussion to have about whether we continue to present it as an intergenerational offering or whether it will revert to being a children's ministry. But my inkling is that actually we persist in our intergenerational approach and adapt for adults who do wish to come. So what we found is that small changes and a long-term emphasis on culture shift can make a big difference. If I could have the next slide, please. I'd like to suggest that any adaptations to the pattern of services or to particular services to better include children and young people may well make the church more accessible. For example, to the unchurched of all ages, to others with varying needs, learning and faith styles, and neurodivergence. Being church all together most of the time gives the children a clear sense of belonging and does not hinder their faith development. Next slide, please. In conclusion, then, I have found that there is a gospel imperative for the inclusion of children in placing them at the centre of the church family, as Jesus did. Liberation theology presents a preferential option for the little ones, which can and should include children, as they still remain the most marginalised in our societies and in the world. The implications for the church can include all churches considering what are the interactions between generations for them. Even a simple audit of this is a starting point to think about how the generations interact. And some adjustments, small adjustments, can be made. We are exploring then how this can work in a typical rural Anglican church setting, as I mentioned, with only one service, and changes impacting everybody, including people who are very attached to a certain way of worshipping. It is possible to bring people with us on this journey, and we've been pleased to see the surprising support for the integration for children in that context. There is a benefit to the whole church in learning and serving alongside each other. Finally, any ideas for future study? I think more can be done on thinking about basic ecclesial communities and applying them to children and possibly young people. And one thing that I would like to study further would be the makeup of the early church and how intergenerational that really was. Thank you very much for listening.